Hello again, everyone. All right, so this is a precursor to our intro to Beowulf. This is a very brief history of what ultimately became Anglo-Saxon England. So our beginning with the history of English literature is an Anglo-Saxon long poem called Beowulf. But of course, Anglo-Saxon England isn't the beginning of time. It's not even really the beginning of culture or literature in the geographical area that's now England or Britain or the UK. It's just the point at which a literature that can now be described as sort of distinctively English, or the beginning of this group that we think of as distinctively English, that's where that sort of starts. That's the place we put the benchmark. And I'm going to give you just a little introduction to how we arrived at that benchmark and why some of what happened before is still important. So, as we've read in Robert Pogue Harrison's book, The Forests, English literary tradition carries a pretty substantial influence from Roman literature, and via the Roman, also Greek, but let's stick with Roman. Much of the English canon, and that word canon means like the long scroll of greatest hits that's officially sanctioned by all the scholars, kind of the list of things that people say, all right, this is the really critical, important stuff, the classics. Much of the English canon is indebted to Roman sources for its tropes and archetypes, stock plots and characters, all that stuff. Knowing Roman mythology, very handy for literature students. Why is that? Great question. So, the very earliest people of the island that we now break down into England, Scotland, and Wales were, as far as we know, the Britons. Britons. You don't have to know that, I'm just telling you. And they were a group of ancient Celtic tribes, note plural, tribes, lots of distinct little pockets that all sort of group under the umbrella term of Britons. And these people were resident on the island from at least the Bronze Age. And that's really important, strangely enough, because at the end of the Bronze Age, as bronze, to make a very long story short, the Bronze Age ended when the material, bronze, kind of fell out of favor. And it became eclipsed by iron, the transition to the Iron Age. At the point of the transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age in England, these Bronze Age people sort of jettisoned all their bronze materials, and one of the ways they did that was they just threw it into rivers and other bodies of water. They just chucked all their useless bronze materials into the rivers, including, very frequently, swords, bronze swords. So just remember, from a sort of critical point of historic decline, later Iron Age people living in England will from time to time discover beautiful Bronze Age swords in rivers and lakes and things. Is this sounding familiar? Is this sounding a little King Arthurish, a little Sword in the Stone-ish? Good, hang on to that. Yes, so the Britons were resident in England on the island from at least the period of the Bronze Age. In the year 55 BC, armies of Julius Caesar, yes, the same Julius Caesar that was ruling during the life of Christ, armies of Julius Caesar landed on the shores of Britain, and this was a really big deal. A really big deal. The idea that the Roman Empire had stretched so far into the edges of the known world, so far as to go across the channel and stake a kind of military claim, or at least pretend to, in Britain? That wilderness of nowhere at the edge of imagination, it was like, I heard one researcher say it was almost like the moon landing. Like it was a huge hype piece for Julius Caesar to do this. So by the 1st century AD, Rome had sort of colonized the southern part of the island of Britain, although very tenuously Colonize is maybe not even quite the right word. Roman rule on the island was largely a matter of military occupation, and that occupation varied in strength, geographical extent, and consistency. But across the English Channel, Rome had taken indisputable control of northwestern Europe, everything that is now France and Belgium. So if you're on the southern shore of England and you look across the English Channel, way over there to the opposite shore, as far as you can see in either direction, all of that, Rome. As a result of the Roman invasion of southern England and the increased trade between Britons and their new Roman power neighbors across the Channel, two languages became widely spoken in the southern half of the island of Britain. One was British Latin, i.e., a locally evolved dialect of the Roman language that was sort of mishmashed with the indigenous language. And of course, the other was Brittonic, the indigenous Celtic language that predated Roman arrival. So, skipping ahead a little bit of time, by the end of the 4th century AD, Britain was technically part of the Roman Empire, but it was sort of the outermost western reach of Rome's influence. And while Roman culture on the island was well established by that point, Roman rule was becoming more and more tenuous. When Rome ultimately withdrew its troops from the island in the early 5th century, specifically the year 410 AD, one popular archaeological narrative suggests that Britain became a kind of free-for-all of raids and invasions by neighboring European tribes, that there was almost like a power vacuum, and in some cases a population vacuum, in the wake of Roman departure, and then there was this upheaval that followed. And it was during that period of upheaval, following Roman departure, that southern Britain began to be overtaken by a Germanic tribe called, you guessed it, the Saxons. So according to this argument of history, and there is some debate among archaeologists on this, but here we are. The Saxons, who migrated over from the North Sea coast of Europe, meaning the Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany, and that will start ringing bells when we read Beowulf, this idea of people coming from places like the Netherlands and Denmark. Those people eventually became the dominant sort of defining cultural group in southern Britain. Their Saxon language and culture are then, of course, influenced and modified in turn by all the various little cultural microcosms that were already in Britain before they got there, in pockets all over the place. And, in the course of time, the newly native culture in southern Britain, i.e., what's now England, becomes what we call Anglo-Saxon, meaning English Saxon. Think Anglophone, meaning English speaking. So the corresponding Anglo-Saxon language is what we now call Old English. When you talk about something that's written in Old English, you're talking about Anglo-Saxon. And it sounds really not unlike German. We think of English as having a lot of Latin roots, and it does. Remember, Rome was there first. But because of that Anglo-Saxon wave, it also has a lot of German roots. Anglo-Saxon looks like this, and I'll see if I can turn you around here while I'm recording and show you. My copy of Beowulf, translated by Seamus Heaney, which is the same copy that you have, includes the original Anglo-Saxon text page by page next to the English translation, and it's really cool. So I'm going to see if I can show you. Can I turn this around? I maybe can't. I don't know. Let's see if I can show you. It might just end up looking backwards. No, the text is just going to end up looking backwards. I'll take a picture and I'll post it afterwards. But yeah, in when we're talking about Old English in literature, we're talking about Anglo-Saxon, and that's where we get Beowulf. For a few more sort of fun tidbits on this whole Anglo-Saxon language thing, the fact that it has a different alphabet, things like that, check out the supplementals for week 2 in the syllabus. There are a couple of YouTube videos One of them is by Tom Scott, and I believe it talks about the different letters of the Old English alphabet and how the alphabet evolved from that first English alphabet to what it is now. Yeah. Tune in next time for Intro to Beowulf.